I do want to let you know that every conference I've ever attended with interpreters ends up discussing ethics. Ethics come into every single aspect of our work. So I know a lot of you have issues you want to discuss that you can't talk about under other circumstances, and this is your one opportunity. So I do understand your eagerness to tell your stories or to solicit comments from your colleagues. And we have had a request to discuss one particular case that involves a lack of equivalence. But I'm going to defer that because after I finish at 12, we're going to have a panel discussing ethics. And I think that would be a good opportunity to bring up the issue of the lack of equivalence between languages and how interpreters are supposed to deal with that. But I would like to now bring the discussion over to a way of looking at situations that doesn't divide them up according to whether they are legal or medical or social services, rather than looking at the overarching field in which they belong, to categorize them in two different groups. And that is adversarial versus collaborative. And I think that the Code of Ethics for court interpreters is written with adversarial situations in mind. And one of the things I've often commented, I can't speak to your Code of Ethics here, but in the United States, the codes of ethics that court interpreters abide by were developed by the legal profession for us, primarily. There has been input from interpreters over the years, but the more interpreters get together and discuss the way they implement the Code of Ethics, the more modifications are being made in codes of ethics. And we recognize that not all situations are adversarial, even within the legal arena. An adversarial situation is anything in which there are differing interests. The goal of the communication is not necessarily the same for all parties involved. Some people have one agenda and some people have another agenda. And often there is a very overt power differential. Someone is in jail. They've been put in jail by the authorities for violating the law. So clearly the power is on the side of the law enforcement agencies and the court system rather than the individual who's charged with the crime. There's a very obvious power differential there. And there's a lot less room for interpreters to intervene. And we've mentioned several incidents when the interpreter felt compelled to intervene for the sake of communication. But we feel really constrained when we do that because we are often in an adversarial situation. But a lot of times, what we are really in is a collaborative situation in which all parties share the same goal. And you're more likely to run into that in something like social services, where a family needs help and the service provider wants to give them help, and it's in everyone's interests for them to communicate clearly. In healthcare is another example. All of the healthcare providers want the best possible health outcome for the patient, which presumably the patient wants also. But there still are subtle power differentials. A doctor is a much more powerful and influential person than a patient who doesn't speak English. A social worker is in a position to make decisions about whether someone gets benefits or not. And all across the board, when people consult with service providers to obtain those services, the provider is in a position of power, of either granting the services or denying the services. So there's a real power differential there, not to mention the language barrier, which creates a powerlessness for the non-English speaker, and social class barriers. Many of the people who come in as immigrants or refugees are indigent. They do not have a lot of formal education. Certainly that's not true of everyone, but in many cases, they come from situations in their country where they already were discriminated against or underprivileged because of their lack of education and resources. So they don't feel that they are in a position to demand things or to speak out for themselves, to advocate for themselves. And that is just part of their mindset, part of their approach to life. I think that is not recognized enough by service providers who simply think in terms of the language barrier. All you need to do is translate my words and we'll be fine. We'll communicate perfectly well. There is much more room for an interpreter to intervene to make sure that people are communicating when the ultimate goal of the interaction is the same for everyone. They want the best possible outcome. So I think it's helpful for us to decide in a given situation, right here and now when I'm interpreting for these people, am I in an adversarial situation or am I in a collaborative situation? So I'd like to look at, in the context of legal interpreting, in law enforcement and in the courts, most of the time the situation is adversarial and you have very strong power differentials. And in business negotiations, the same is true. One side has their own interests and the other side has different interests. But can you think of a situation in the legal realm where the two parties that you're interpreting for have the same goal in mind, have similar interests? Yes?
Victim witness assistance.
Victim witness assistance. The victim wants justice to be done, and the Crown or the prosecutor or the social worker who's working with them also wants them to get the assistance they need and for justice to be done.
Sometimes it could be adversarial because sometimes the victim or the witness wants to withdraw their statement or
Yes.
does not want to testify in court, and it's kind of hard. It's like a runaround all the time.
Yes, it can turn adversarial. You can start out in a collaborative situation where seemingly everyone has the same roles or the same goals, but it can become adversarial. And that's true in healthcare, it's true in education, in social services, in lots of different situations. You assume that you're working in a collaborative situation, and then it becomes apparent that people have different objectives, different agendas. What's another example in the legal arena of a collaborative communicative event?
Mental health court.
Mental health court. When people want the well-being of the person and they're trying to decide what is the safest place for that person to be, where can their needs best be met. And again, that can turn adversarial because often the individual involved wants to stay out in the world and be free and not have constraints on them, but the other side thinks, no, you're a danger to yourself and others, so you need to be confined or involved in a program of some sort. So I would like you to look at some specific cases. If you have an attorney-client conference, the attorney is defending a person in a criminal case or in a lawsuit, and they're discussing the case and planning the defense. Is that collaborative or adversarial? Collaborative most of the time. It could become adversarial, but it is primarily collaborative. So if you're an interpreter, your approach to the communication is going to be different in an attorney-client conference in a law office than it would be if you were in open court in the middle of a jury trial. And that's a very important thing to bear in mind. A competency hearing, which is what you mentioned, mental health hearings, is, as we say, most of the time collaborative. Dependency proceedings, when you have children involved and they're in a situation of abuse or neglect and something needs to be done to help those children, is that collaborative or adversarial?
Depends on the worker.
Depends on the worker.
Yeah, no, it is adversarial.
Pure adversarial.
Okay, can you elaborate on that?
Well, if there are definitely at the beginning two sides which don't agree, then they cannot be collaborated.
Well, when we're talking about children, though, we're not talking about the parents. Or if they want to remove the children from the custody of the parents, then of course it does become adversarial. But the person who's working with the children,
Yeah, but
if you are interpreting for the social worker who is, or the attorney in some cases, who represents the children, then that it's collaborative within the confines of that relationship. But all of these things are not very clear-cut. Do you have special drug courts here that deal only with people who have committed drug offenses? We have a lot of courts like that now in the U.S. that the idea is to get people into treatment rather than punishing them if they have a substance abuse problem. And so the judge in a court like that will not be sentencing people to jail. They will be placing them in a treatment program, and the person has to come back after a certain period of time and demonstrate that they have quit taking drugs, basically, that they're free of the habit. Is that adversarial or collaborative? It's collaborative. Everyone wants the person to get off drugs and to lead a productive, normal life. But sometimes under the influence of those drugs, the person decides, I don't want to cooperate in this. I don't want to do this anymore. And then it becomes adversarial. But in drug court, assuming that people do have the same objectives in mind, here you are in a court of law with a judge on the bench, with attorneys there, and you would think that would be the classic adversarial situation, but it isn't necessarily. If everyone wants the best outcome for this person who has a substance abuse problem, then you can consider it to be more of a collaborative situation, which means that as an interpreter, you might be able to take a little bit more liberty in deciding to intervene with a clarification. So what I'd like you to do in your groups is to discuss collaborative situations you've been in and adversarial situations you've been in. And it may be the same case that you're talking about. And how that, either the collaborative nature of it or the adversarial nature of it, affected your interpreting, your behavior, your implementation of the role of the interpreter. So does everyone understand the questions that you are discussing? I would like to give you 15 minutes to discuss that in your tables, and then we will have some reporting back. 15 minutes means about 22:12.
Actually, there's some situations
Uy, jodido, ya moví la cámara. Cuando lo estés editando, esto lo podés eliminar.
Esto te lo medio apreté.
Sí, pero este trípode no sirve para ni cuenta. Pero yo no sabía porque este trípode lo he ocupado 100% para fotografía. Para fotografía es perfecto.
El mono para fotografía es amazing.
Pero esto para filmar no sirve para nada.
Esto que ahora estamos hablando es the way. Estamos filmándonos hablando.
Sí, pero no quiero perder lo que...
I didn't bring my school bell, but I could use a school bell or a gong or a buzzer or something. Time to stop talking now, please. Wow, that worked. Thank you. Okay. I do want to leave time for the ethics panel, so I'm going to sort of telescope what we have left for our discussion of these issues. So I would like to hear from a table that could not reach agreement, that you had a difference of opinion around your table about whether a given situation was collaborative or adversarial, or about how the interpreter should or should have handled such a situation. Did anybody have a disagreement that you'd like to share with us? You all agree? Wow.
We
Yes.
had an
Okay.
initial disagreement.
All right, please stand up. This is being recorded, so we need all of the people to speak out loud so that the mics will pick up your voices. Thank you.
We had an initial disagreement because not everybody was clear about the meaning of adversarial or collaborative. So I looked up adversarial in the Oxford Advanced American Dictionary,
All right.
which literally says that it's a legal or political situation involving people who are in opposition and who make attacks on each other. And once we were clear about this, then we sorted out that adversarial situations were those in court, for example, or at the Immigration Refugee Board here in Canada, versus collaborating situations as in a doctor's office, in a clinic, in a hospital, the attorney-client conference at the law office, and community centers, education meetings with the parents and teachers, situations like that.
Okay. Now, can anyone give us an example of the cases you discussed at your table, of a case that started out collaborative? You were expecting it to be collaborative, and then it turned adversarial.
Yes, we have this.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I've been in a situation that it was collaborative and then it turned all of a sudden adversarial. It was in the social service and I interpreted in Dari Farsi, and then the caseworker got all the information and all of a sudden she asked, how did you manage in your home country? Did you get everything from the government? And because when we came here first and we worked and some people clean toilets, and I'm sorry to say this and that, and why don't you go and work? And the caseworker also, this is when the client said, okay, in my home country, one person works and we can feed the whole family. Now I am almost 60, I can't learn, I don't know the language, I go everywhere, I can't find a job. Take us back to the same country from where you brought us. And actually they were brought from one of the former Soviet republics. And so it was, it affected me even, and I didn't know, I got a little, nervous now to do, but I'm honest always when we got out, because he was my client, I'm a settlement counselor, and I usually fix the appointment and help him. I had to show him the right way. I told him, you can complain to our supervisor and write a letter or whatever, change the caseworker.
Okay, so you took off your interpreter hat and put on your counselor hat, and in your particular situation, you have a dual role. Not all interpreters are in a position to be able to help people afterwards, and certainly shouldn't. It depends on what your job is, what you're hired for. Yes, the dream team, or no, the pretty colorful ladies.
Our example is family court, because it could start as collaborative, but because they're looking at the child's best interest in custody or child access, but then it turns into adversarial and emotional charge. That could be an example of, it starts collaborative, but it turns into adversarial.
And how did that affect the interpreter? Did the interpreter intervene a little bit more while it was collaborative and then remain much more tightly impartial?
Well, the consensus was that because it's so emotionally charged, it definitely is hard to detach yourself from the situation, so it could potentially affect the ability of the interpreter to provide an accurate translation without getting involved.
Thank you. And this table had an example.
We discussed this issue, and the overall conclusion.
Stand up, please.
The overall conclusion was that more or less any situation could start off collaborative and then turn adversarial, or vice versa. That was our sort of overall evaluation of most situations that we've been. Except for, like, for the doctor's office, or the least likely to turn adversarial. And then we put down a few notes here that it's important for interpreters to maintain their calm, and transparency of impartiality is the key value of the interpreter's role. To maintain that impartiality and the transparency of it is very important, so that nobody will feel that you are taking sides. That way best control the situation. The points that we put down here, because the situation can change so quickly, and that was the conclusion that we arrived. I don't know if that was...
Okay. I sense some resistance when I use the term intervene, that the interpreter can intervene in a collaborative situation. And what I mean by intervene is sensing that the two sides do not understand each other due to some reason that you are aware of because you know both languages and both cultures. And not providing an explanation yourself or speaking out in favor of one side or the other. No, he doesn't understand. What you're trying to do is blah, blah, blah. That's not the kind of intervention I'm referring to. There's a concept called incremental intervention. Some of you may have seen this. The idea of a pyramid. And the base of the pyramid, the widest, broadest part, is most of the work that interpreters do. You convey messages primarily on a linguistic level. And as you get up to the narrower parts of the pyramid, you intervene for clarification or because there is a serious misunderstanding due to a cultural barrier. And the idea of the pyramid is that you always want to slide back down to the base. So there may be times when you feel the need to step in for the purposes of facilitating communication, but you always want to revert back to that neutral, impartial role as soon as you possibly can. And by intervention, I mean, for example, suggesting a different way of asking a question, not doing it yourself, and not saying, you should ask it this way, but say to the service provider, would you like a suggestion about a way to approach this with the client? And if they say, no, I don't want any suggestions, then you go back to your base role. But if they do, if they're genuinely struggling to communicate with the client and they want to help them, they may welcome a suggestion. If you ask it this way instead of that way, perhaps understanding will take place. You don't know if it will. Maybe they're still going to misunderstand each other. But you can make a suggestion and allow them to proceed. Keep the relationship between the service provider and the client as much as possible. There are times when you step in to facilitate. That's the kind of intervention I mean. And if you're on the witness stand, you certainly cannot suggest a question to the examining attorney. That would be totally unprofessional and unethical. But if you're an attorney-client consult, perhaps, if you suggest, why don't you ask, or not why don't you, but may I suggest that you ask the question this way? Or I believe your client may be misunderstanding this concept. And then just step back and allow them to take over again. You have a question or comment? Could you please stand up?
Sometimes I use that term in discoveries. Could you please rephrase your question?
Mm-hmm.
And it's really helpful.
Yes, and that's an intervention.
Right.
That's what I'm talking about. So the way you intervene is very important to maintain everyone's role boundaries. You are not usurping the role of the service provider, and you are not putting yourself in the place of the non-English speaking client. Rather, you are facilitating communication. And the words you use are very important. If you begin with, may the interpreter suggest, or if you don't mind, the interpreter would like to make a suggestion, or the interpreter has noticed that there's a misunderstanding, may I suggest a different way of phrasing that? Or could you please rephrase it so that it can be interpreted more accurately? Put it in the, always indicate that the goal is communication, not that you are taking over the interview or the communication. So the last thing that I want to cover in the time we have left is what you do to prepare for an assignment. And I must say that I am very impressed with multi-languages. The things I hear from the interpreters about working for multi-languages, it sounds like the needs of the interpreter and the goals of transparency and ethical behavior are upheld at all times. And that's not always the case. So I would like to see what you do when someone calls you for an assignment. Can you be at 123 Main Street Tuesday afternoon at 3 to interpret? I often get calls like that. What questions do you ask of an agency that is not as enlightened as multi-language? Yes. Yes.
Well,
Please stand up.
Yes. Basic questions that you need to ask is, what will be the main topic to be discussed, and what is the setting that, for example, dictates to me how I should dress?
Yes.
And what research regarding terminology or background information I have to do before going to the interpretation assignment. And even if I'm actually qualified, if the topic is something like neuroscience or something that I'm not qualified to do, then I will decline.
All right. Any other questions that you ask? Yes.
Also the dialect that the client speaks.
In many cases, you need to know exactly where they're from so that you can determine. Often the service provider doesn't know. That's the problem. They know what country they're from and that's all. Or somebody has said Arabic, for example, but you don't know what variety of Arabic it is. So you ask as many questions as you can to pinpoint the subject matter and the nature of the case and where the non-English speaker is from, what language they speak, and so forth. But you don't always get those answers right away. The person calling you to make the assignment is not always aware of those. So what else can you do to get the answers? Yes?
How much do they pay usually?
How much do they pay? That is definitely something you want to agree on.
Duration of the assignment.
The duration of the assignment, okay. But what I'm saying is you can't get information that you really need about who the parties are and what's the nature of the case. What do you ask? Or what do you do?
Well, I actually run an interpreter services department, and so I require the provider to fill out a work order with all the specifics.
Great.
And so that way I can give that to my interpreters, and specifically if it's a case, I don't know, trafficking, or selling tobacco without a license or something like that, I'll look up the law and then give that information to the interpreter so they can bone up on their vocabulary.
Great.
So I give them as much information as possible.
And interpreters should know to ask for that. Yes?
Yeah, let's say when I'm sent to interpret at the court reporting network, number of times I'm not told whether that is a mediation or examination for discovery. So when I come to the front desk, I always ask what kind of hearing will be, and also I ask for the names. I always ask for the names of the lawyers or the mediator or whoever is there, and the claimant as well, because we don't get usually those information. So in advance I already know the names, and then I don't struggle on the record because those hearings are recorded as well. So I have clear pronunciation of their names, because sometimes their name could be difficult as difficult as my name. So and I have that information, and let's say if it is a work injury or is it a traffic accident or something like that, then I have some kind of broad information and necessary information for the beginning.
Thank you. You have a hand up here.
Also do
Stand up, please.
can also do research of the location and agency that you're going to, whether it's a health agency, a shelter. Like these days, everybody has a website.
Yes.
So you can find a lot of the background information about what kind of services that place provide, and you kind
Yeah,
of get some background.
that's what I had in mind, actually. I interpreted a lot of depositions. And if someone asks me to be at a law firm I'm not familiar with, I don't know what kind of law they practice. So I look up their webpage. Do they do personal injury lawsuit? Do they do workers' compensation, medical malpractice? What are their fields? So that I have a sense of what area I'm dealing with. And if I can't get the information, in my case, I work for agencies that aren't nearly as enlightened as you all apparently are, and they don't know any of that. So I ask for a phone number of a person who is directly involved in the case, the person who asked them to provide an interpreter, to try to get as much information as I can about the nature of the case. And I know that a lot of agencies will not give you a phone number because they don't want any direct contact. But then I will show up early at the assignment and ask, can you please give me a briefing about, you know, what kind of law is this? What is the subject matter? Is it a car accident, or what is the incident involved? And I bring material so that I can do a really quick study of terminology, and I brainstorm, think what's likely to come up. If it's a car accident, I know it's going to be about the cars driving, the road conditions and visibility and things like that, and maybe makes of cars and car parts and things like that. So I'm going to be doing brainstorming and trying to call up a lot of those terms to refresh my memory. Yes, way in back.
This is more like assignment of the task. In the old days, I would be told that the assignment is, it's in the Chenango area. Today, I asked the coordinator, where is it? They didn't know. And I can't even commit to taking the assignment if she is unable to tell me where in the GTA the thing is taking place. But today, we have to Google that information ourselves. So that's one problem. And the second thing is, recently I've been asking for Slovak, and when I turned up the place, it turns out it was Slovenian. At least twice. And so I have to, so if you work with Slovak or Slovenian, ask, are you sure it's Slovenian you want? Or are you Slovak?
Yes. So that brings us to the pre-session, when you're establishing who's who. And that part of that may take place ahead of time over the telephone. But when you actually show up, you talk to the person you're going to be interpreting for to find out if they speak Slovenian or Slovak. And sometimes that's the moment when everything has to come to a halt because they got an interpreter in the wrong language. What are the other kinds of things that you would mention to the actual parties you're going to be working with at that moment in that interpreting assignment before it all starts? Yes?
The duration we are booked for. It's very important.
How long you're going to be? Okay.
Yes, and what time to what time I'm going to stay with you.
Okay.
Especially in discoveries, it's very important.
Yes. Yes.
That I would like
Stand up, please.
I would like the provider to speak directly to the client, that if I raise my hand, it's because I have a question, or I need you to speak a little slower, that everything will be confidential. And of course, I let them know who I am.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
All right. I'm the interpreter. I am here to interpret everything that is said. I will interpret in the first person. Please direct your words directly to your client, and so on and so forth. Those are the kinds of things. And I know that in many legal situations, you don't have time for that. No one is expecting that to happen. And it's all in a big rush. There's the person, let's get going. Everybody's assembled, let's start. And there is very little time for you to do that. So you need to condense it into what they call an elevator speech. With those few moments you have with someone, how can you cram in as much explanation of your role as possible? And then during the session, sometimes you do need to ask for clarification. And a lot of interpreters are reluctant to use any kind of resources during the interpreting assignment. They don't want to be seen consulting a dictionary or they don't want to admit that they don't know what a term means, so they just guess or they skip it. But it's really important for you to use all resources available to you at all times, including dictionaries, glossaries, and the people right there in the room who know the case better than you do. Yes?
So to add on to that, one resource I find often helpful is right now there are all these dictionary translation apps that we can put on our BlackBerries, iPhones, and Androids.
Yes.
Which, and they're faster, so you don't even need to carry a real dictionary around.
Yes.
You can just
The only problem with that is connectivity. In many environments, you're not allowed to have access to the internet. Yes. Then what do you do afterwards for your own personal, professional development? What do you do after an assignment? Look up the words that I have problems with. Yes. Yeah, so you're going to have ongoing glossary maintenance. At the end of every assignment, jot down the terms that you struggled with. You may have come up with a good way of doing it on the fly, but you're still not that happy with it, or you're not sure if you really got it right. So you write it down, and then you either look it up or you talk to colleagues. So-and-so said this today, or a person from this country used this term. Have you ever come across that? And how did you interpret it? In my case with Spanish, we have people from a lot of different countries. So I try to have contacts from all those different countries. And if I hear a new term, I'll call someone from that same country or email them and say, what does this mean? Or have you ever come across this? How would you translate this into English? And unfamiliar English terms too, new ways of legal jargon and that kind of thing.
May I add also something?
Yes.
Say, the Immigration Refugee Board, when the minister is included intervene in the hearing, then usually that is about war crimes. And the person obviously participated in the war and in the military. So there are so many ranks, and I'm accredited for 3 languages, and all 3 languages, the ranks are different.
Mm-hmm.
So what I did, I actually downloaded from the internet for each my language those military ranks, and I added by myself, and at every hearing, I always have that military ranks in front of me. So as soon, and I learned how to use that very quickly, so when some rank is, for God's sake, I wouldn't know it even now. If you ask me if I don't look at that, I wouldn't be able to repeat it. Of course, during the course of time of 10 years or more, actually, since I was accredited with the Immigration Refugee Board, I learned a lot. But still, it is a good idea to download from the internet, especially those kind of military ranks.
Yes. And new things are being made available all the time. So you want to be in contact with colleagues who have the same language combination as you do to find out, oh, so-and-so just discovered this great glossary of engineering terms in our language pair, or a definition of all of these workers' compensation concepts, because the workers' compensation law was just revised and they're going to be using a lot of new terms. Here's a good website I found for looking up those terms. That's the kind of thing that you want to keep up with, and the colleagues are the most valuable resources because they know exactly what you need, and your needs are generally the same. We're not going to do the buzz groups here, but I think we've covered a lot of these issues. Does anyone have any further additions to the discussion we've had? Yes, stand up please.
You asked what we will do when we finish the assignment.
Yes.
I always collect my own notes. Sometimes if I'm at court, the lawyers ask. I give it to them, otherwise I put down right away and back to home.
I'm sorry, I didn't
Destroy the notes.
understand.
Destroy the
Okay.
notes.
Yes.
Right after finishing my assignment.
Yes. Well, what I do is jot down the words first, and then I shred.
Exactly.
Because the words are important to retain, but yes, you do want to destroy your notes because there is personal information there, confidential information contained in the notes. Anything else? Yes.
I always like to look back over the assignment that I've done and keep in my mind that no matter how well I think I performed, keep my open mind and think that no matter how good you are, you can still make improvements. So I always look back, especially on a difficult assignment, to adjust in my head, how did I handle it, how could I have done it better, and how different or otherwise better I could perform the next time. I think that in my life has helped me a lot to make myself better and professionally develop myself into a better interpreter. And I think there's always room for improvement.
Yes.
And there is also another...
Excuse me, there was someone else at this table who had her hand up? Yes.
Yes, I always ask for the location, the closest intersection, the room number.
Oh, this is before the session. Yes.
And I'll write down. I'll Google, map Google, so if I am driving, I wanted to know how long the distance. And if I'm taking a bus also, I will either call the TTC or I'll find out in the Google Maps.
That's a
I
really...
will always leave 1 hour or half an hour before the assignment.
Yes.
So I have more space for myself, because when I am late or even on time, I'm anxious and
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Figure out how long it's going to take you to get to the assignment and allow a little bit of leeway for traffic accidents or parking problems or whatever, and then plan to arrive with a 15-minute cushion so that you can gather your wits and, you know, collect your glossaries and get all your materials together before you begin interpreting. There's nothing worse than rushing in because you're late and you couldn't find a parking place or the bus was late and you're thinking about, oh dear, I'm late, rather than how do I concentrate on this interpreting assignment. Yes?
On that same note of preparing for an assignment, I don't know if it helps people, but especially...
Could you stand up, please?
Sorry. Especially when lots of assignments I've been doing were like kind of emotionally charged. So when I arrive the 15 minutes early, I always make sure that I have, whether it's in the toilets or waiting somewhere, I meditate for 5 minutes, and that kind of allows me to leave me behind and get ready for the meditation. So I have this kind of shield to protect myself emotionally and be professional.
Okay. Yes.
Yeah, there is also one thing what I think that all of us interpreters should do. If when you are in a very intensive interpretation, let's say during the hearings at the Immigration and Refugee Board specifically, then you run and you use some synonym which might not fit really in that context very much. And then during the break you recall it, and then when you return you ask to have a note of an interpreter on the record and correct yourself and say, I interpreted this particular word on this and this way. However, in this context, I think that this word would be more appropriate, that from now on I would use this. And they always appreciate that correction.
Good. There was a hand up over here. We have time for 2 more comments. So first you, and then we'll stop. Yes.
Within the topic of resources that we can use, I'd like to recommend your glossary, the Interpreter's
Well, it's only
Companion.
for Spanish, though.
For Spanish, plus the Oxford Dictionary, Oxford Spanish Dictionary, which you can buy in the CD-ROM and install on any computer. And the Collins Spanish Dictionary, the latest version, is available for free at wordreference.com.
Okay, thank you. And the gentleman in back.
I find that, don't be afraid to ask, if they use abbreviation or acronym or something like that, because that sometimes you are in a hospital, in a field that you use, doctors, and then they may use a lot of abbreviations like COPD, PRN, RPN, DIB, DIBQ. So you should ask, right? Otherwise, you get lost, or maybe you are in a field they ask, about oil and gas industry, and they may say about something about fracking. You don't know what's fracking is. It's a way of, like extracting, like the gas from the shale gas or something like that. Or maybe you are in a field that you are not familiar, and they use a lot of terminology or acronyms, right? So don't be afraid to ask, because you may learn something new too.
Acronyms in particular, I've learned all kinds of, well, I haven't learned them, I've heard a lot of acronyms since coming here, that you all have all these organizations and certifications and things that are unfamiliar to me. But yes, find out what those acronyms stand for, and if you can't get the information from people, you often can get it from written material about whatever agency or program it is. From their website or brochures lying around in the waiting room or whatever. So thank you all for your contributions, and we're going to thank you very much. And as I said, we will continue the discussion of ethics because it never gets old. Thank you.